Chapter 19 of Anna Karenina, Book 4, by Leo Tolstoy, translated by Constance Garnett. This recording is in the public domain. The mistake made by Alexey Alexandrovitch in that, when preparing for seeing his wife, he had overlooked the possibility that her repentance might be sincere, and he might forgive her, and she might not die. This mistake was 2 months after his return from Moscow brought home to him in all its significance. But the mistake made by him had arisen not simply from his having overlooked that contingency, but also from the fact that until that day of his interview with his dying wife, he had not known his own heart. At his sick wife's bedside he had for the first time in his life given way to that feeling of sympathetic suffering always roused in him by the sufferings of others, and hitherto looked on him with shame as a harmful weakness. And pity for her, and remorse for having desired her death, and most of all, the joy of forgiveness, made him at once conscious, not simply of the relief of his own sufferings, but of a spiritual peace he had never experienced before. He suddenly felt that the very thing that was the source of his sufferings had become the source of his spiritual joy, that what had seemed insoluble while he was judging, blaming, and hating had become clear and simple when he forgave and loved. He forgave his wife and pitied her for her sufferings and her remorse. He forgave Vronsky and pitied him, especially after reports reached him of his despairing action. He felt more for his son than before, and he blamed himself now for having taken too little interest in him. But for the little newborn baby he felt a quite peculiar sentiment, not of pity only, but of tenderness. At first, from a feeling of compassion alone, he had been interested in the delicate little creature, who was not his child, and who was cast on one side during her mother's illness, and would certainly have died if he had not troubled about her. And he did not himself observe how fond he became of her. He would go into the nursery several times a day, and sit there for a long while, so that the nurses, who were at first afraid of him, got quite used to his presence. Sometimes for half an hour at a stretch he would sit silently gazing at the saffron-red, downy, wrinkled face of the sleeping baby, watching the movements of the frowning brows, and the fat little hands, with clenched fingers, that rubbed the little eyes and nose. At such moments particularly, Alexey Alexandrovitch had a sense of perfect peace and inward harmony, and saw nothing extraordinary in his position, nothing that ought to be changed. But as time went on he saw more and more distinctly that however natural the position now seemed to him, he would not long be allowed to remain in it. He felt that besides the blessed spiritual force controlling his soul, there was another, a brutal force, as powerful or more powerful, which controlled his life, and that this force would not allow him that humble peace he longed for. He felt that everyone was looking at him with inquiring wonder, that he was not understood, that something was expected of him. Above all he felt the instability and unnaturalness of his relations with his wife. When the softening effect of the near approach of death had passed away, Alexey Alexandrovitch began to notice that Anna was afraid of him, ill at ease with him, and could not look him straight in the face. She seemed to be wanting, and not daring, to tell him something. As though foreseeing their present relations could not continue, she seemed to be expecting something from him. Towards the end of February it happened that Anna's baby daughter, who had been named Anna too, fell ill. Alexey Alexandrovitch was in the nursery in the morning, and leaving orders for the doctor to be sent for, he went to his office. On finishing his work he returned home at 4. Going into the hall he saw a handsome groom, in a braided livery and a bear fur cape, holding a white fur cloak. "Who is here?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "Princess Elizaveta Fedorovna Tverskaya," the groom answered, and it seemed to Alexey Alexandrovitch that he grinned. During all this difficult time Alexey Alexandrovitch had noticed that his worldly acquaintances, especially women, took a peculiar interest in him and his wife. All these acquaintances he observed with difficulty concealing their mirth at something. The same mirth he had perceived in the lawyer's eyes, and just now in the eyes of this groom. Everyone seemed, somehow, hugely delighted, as though they had just been at a wedding. When they met him, With ill-disguised enjoyment they inquired after his wife's health. The Princess Tverskaya was unpleasant to Alexey Alexandrovitch from the memories associated with her, and also because he disliked her, and he went straight to the nursery. In the day nursery Seryozha, leaning on the table with his legs on a chair, was drawing and chatting away merrily. The English governess, who had during Anna's illness replaced the French one, was sitting near the boy knitting a shawl. She hurriedly got up, curtsied, and pulled Seryozha. Alexey Alexandrovitch stroked his son's hair, answered the governess's inquiries about his wife, and asked what the doctor had said of the baby. "The doctor said it was nothing serious, and he ordered a bath, sir." "But she is in pain," said Alexey Alexandrovitch, listening to the baby's screaming in the next room. "I think it's the wet nurse, sir," the Englishwoman said firmly. "What makes you think so?" he asked, stopping short. "It's just as it was at the Countess Paul's, sir. They gave the baby medicine, and it turned out that the baby was simply hungry. The nurse had no milk, sir." Alexey Alexandrovitch pondered, and, after standing still a few seconds, he went in at the other door. The baby was lying with its head thrown back, stiffening itself in the nurse's arms, and would not take the plump breast offered it, and it never ceased screaming in spite of the double hushing of the wet nurse and the other nurse who was bending over her. "Still no better?" said Alexey Alexandrovitch. "She's very restless," answered the nurse in a whisper. "Miss Edwards says that perhaps the wet nurse has no milk," he said. "I think so too, Alexey Alexandrovitch." "Then why didn't you say so?" "Who's one to say it to? Anna Arkadyevna's still ill," said the nurse discontentedly. The nurse was an old servant of the family, and in her simple words there seemed to Alexey Alexandrovitch an allusion to his position. The baby screamed louder than ever, struggling and sobbing. The nurse, with a gesture of despair, went to it, took it from the wet nurse's arms, and began walking up and down, rocking it. "You must ask the doctor to examine the wet nurse," said Alexey Alexandrovitch. The smartly dressed and healthy-looking nurse, frightened at the idea of losing her place, muttered something to herself, and covering her bosom, smiled contemptuously at the idea of doubts being cast on her abundance of milk. In that smile, too, Alexey Alexandrovitch saw a sneer at his position. "Luckless child," said the nurse, hushing the baby, and still walking up and down with it. Alexey Alexandrovitch sat down, and with a despondent and suffering face watched the nurse walking to and fro. When the child at last was still, and had been put in a deep bed, and the nurse, after smoothing the little pillow, had left her, Alexey Alexandrovitch got up, and walking awkwardly on tiptoe, approached the baby. For a minute he was still, and with the same despondent face gazed at the baby. But all at once a smile, that moved his hair and the skin of his forehead, came out of his face, and he went softly out of the room. In the dining room he rang the bell, and told the servant who came in to send again for the doctor. He felt vexed with his wife for not being anxious about this exquisite baby, and in this vexed humor he had no wish to go to her. He had no wish either to see Princess Betsy. But his wife might wonder why he did not go to her as usual, and so, overcoming his disinclination, he went towards the bedroom. As he walked over the soft rug towards the door, he could not help overhearing a conversation he did not want to hear. "If you hadn't been going away, I could have understood your answer, and his too. But your husband ought to be above that," Betsy was saying. "It's not for my husband. For myself I don't wish it. Don't say that," answered Anna's excited voice. "But you must care to say good‐bye to a man who has shot himself on your account." "That's just why I don't want to." With a dismayed and guilty expression, Alexey Alexandrovitch stopped and would have gone back unobserved, but reflecting that this would be undignified, he turned back again, and clearing his throat, he went up to the bedroom. The voices were silent, and he went in. Anna, in a gray dressing-gown, with a crop of short clustering black curls on her round head, was sitting on a settee. The eagerness died out of her face, as it always did, at the sight of her husband. She dropped her head and looked round uneasily at Betsy. Betsy, dressed in the height of the latest fashion, in a hat that towered somewhere over her head like a shade on a lamp, in a blue dress with violet crosswise strips slanting one way on the bodice and the other on the skirt, was sitting beside Anna, her tall flat figure held erect. Bowing her head, she greeted Alexey Alexandrovitch with an ironical smile. "Ah!" she said, as though surprised. "I'm very glad you're at home. You never put in an appearance anywhere, and I haven't seen you ever since Anna has been ill. I have heard all about it, your anxiety. Yes, you're a wonderful husband," she said, with a meaning and affable air, as though she were bestowing an order of magnanimity on him for his conduct to his wife. Alexey Alexandrovitch bowed frigidly, and kissing his wife's hand, asked how she was. "Better, I think," she said, avoiding his eyes. "But you've rather a feverish-looking color," he said, laying stress on the word feverish. "We've been talking too much," said Betsy. "I feel it's selfishness on my part, and I am going away." She got up, but Anna, suddenly flushing, quickly caught at her hand. "No, wait a minute, please. I must tell you. No, you," she turned to Alexey Alexandrovitch, and her neck and brow were suffused with crimson. "I won't and can't keep anything secret from you," she said. Alexey Alexandrovitch cracked his fingers and bowed his head. "Betsy's been telling me that Count Vronsky wants to come here, to say good‐bye, before his departure for Tashkend." She did not look at her husband, and was evidently in haste to have everything out, however hard it might be for her. "I told her I could not receive him." "You said, my dear, that it would depend on Alexey Alexandrovitch," Betsy corrected her. "Oh, no, I can't receive him. And what object would there...." She stopped suddenly, and glanced inquiringly at her husband. He did not look at her. "In short, I don't wish it." Alexey Alexandrovitch advanced and would have taken her hand. Her first impulse was to jerk back her hand from the damp hand with big swollen veins that sought hers, but with an obvious effort to control herself she pressed his hand. "I am very grateful to you for your confidence, but," he said, feeling with confusion and annoyance that what he could decide easily and clearly by himself he could not discuss before Princess Tverskaya, who to him stood for the incarnation of that brute force which would inevitably control him in the life he led in the eyes of the world, and hinder him from giving way to his feeling of love and forgiveness. He stopped short, looking at Princess Tverskaya. "Well, good‐bye, my darling," said Betsy, getting up. She kissed Anna and went out. Alexey Alexandrovitch escorted her out. "Alexey Alexandrovitch, I know you are a truly magnanimous man," said Betsy, stopping in the little drawing‐room, and with special warmth shaking hands with him once more. "I am an outsider, but I so love her and respect you that I venture to advise. Receive him. Alexey Vronsky is the soul of honor, and he is going away to Tashkend." "Thank you, princess, for your sympathy and advice. But the question of whether my wife can or cannot see anyone she must decide herself." He said this from habit, lifting his brows with dignity, and reflecting immediately that whatever his words might be, there could be no dignity in his position. And he saw this by the suppressed, malicious, and ironical smile with which Betsy glanced at him after this phrase. Chapter 19.